So I picked up this beautiful heritage red everbearing raspberry at a local big box store a few weeks ago, and I finally got around to planting it into its new home today. I thought I would just talk a little bit about a few of the factors that go into making sure your raspberry plant is happy and productive even when it's grown in a container. I think they're actually a really good candidate for a smaller container garden, simply because they do spread through suckers and can be locally invasive, particularly if you're trying to plant them among a number of other plants. And generally speaking, they do pretty well in containers. So the first thing that I would say keep in mind is the variety that you're picking out. Some factors to consider when you're choosing a variety are flavor profile, right? The yellow raspberries, red raspberries, black raspberries all taste a little bit different. Is it a variety that's going to do well in your particular growing climate in your zone? Is it a summer bearing variety or an everbearing variety, which really just means that it has both a summer harvest as well as a fall harvest? Is it a dwarf raspberry plant or a full-size raspberry plant? Is it a thornless variety or is it a very thorny variety like this one here? This particular variety is a bog standard heritage red everbearing raspberry, one of the more common ones that you're going to find out there. Now, in terms of container size, if you did pick up one of the dwarf varieties, you can probably get away with a smaller 16-inch diameter planting pot. Because this is a full-sized heritage variety, I've gone ahead and planted it in a larger 20-inch diameter black plastic pot. Now, the black plastic is really not ideal. In fact, I would recommend, if you can get a large enough one, go with a non-woven fabric grow bag, right? The aeration on those is terrific, which is a particular boon for raspberries because they absolutely hate to have soggy feet. They really get root rot quite easily, and these black plastic pots are not exactly known for their terrific drainage and aeration. In fact, that's why I have drilled a number of large drainage holes sort of around the side bottom as well as the actual bottom of the pot. With regards to planting medium, they like a loamy, high organic, well-draining, slightly acidic soil. Not so acidic as something like a blueberry, but not neutral either. Does it ever seem to you like that description matches just about everything that's fun to grow in the garden, leaving those of us with heavy clay soil with nothing to grow? I digress. I've gone ahead and planted this in my favorite budget DIY planting mix, which is really just steer manure, topsoil, a very cheap potting mix that happens to be primarily wood fine, so provides a little bit of drainage and aeration, as well as some sphagnum peat moss. That mix works really well for me, and I actually have a video on how to put it together. It's really cheap, really easy to do. I'll add that video link in the description. You may or may not have noticed that I am kind of perched here in between an almond tree on one side and a rather delightful Japanese mock orange hedge on the other side. And the reason for that is this particular variety is actually really not recommended for my growing zone. Our summers here are simply too brutally hot. In fact, in a few short months, we're going to be getting over 100 degrees quite frequently. So this location is basically going to enforce a partial shade 6 to 8 hours of sunlight per day. Raspberries, like many other delightful fruiting plants, generally want 8+ hours of full sun, but I have decided to optimize around giving them plenty of shade because I can tell that this one is already getting a little bit burnt and we're in April. The downside of that is that I'll probably have a slightly diminished harvest and the fruit might have a slightly lower sugar content simply because it's not getting as much sunlight or as many hours of sunlight through the day. But I think it's worth it to make sure that it grows strong and healthy, and I don't think it will if I'm giving it, 8, 9, 10 hours of our brutally hot sun. The nice thing about growing in a container like this is, of course, if it doesn't work out, I can always move it. Whew, excuse me, I'm becoming an ugly, sweaty mess out here. It is already so hot. Speaking of it being so hot, I talked a little bit about how raspberries really don't like to have wet feet. The truth is, I am much more concerned with this drying out, which is why I've added a absolutely enormous 2-3 inch thick layer of wood chip mulch. In my experience, this wood chip mulch is basically going to prevent this plant from ever truly drying out. Obviously, if you leave it long enough without ever watering it, that's not going to be the case, but I found that this is super effective at preventing evaporation. And that's what I'm going to optimize for here. And I've watered it very thoroughly just to make sure that there are sort of minimal air pockets and that the roots make good contact with the new soil around it. Going forward, however, I'm going to be somewhat judicious, making sure that we're not creating sort of an anaerobic waterlogged situation in here. In my experience, a very large container like this one with so much wood chip mulch will probably need to be watered about once a week, deeply, but only once a week in spring until we reach those really hot peak summer months, and then we'll probably increase that to 2 to 3 times a week. If I did not have this mulch, I honestly think I would still have to water this at least once a day, if not twice a day, just because this black plastic is going to heat up so much. I've gone ahead and skipped the trellis today because we don't really get much in the way of summer storms, and this plant is in a very sheltered location between a tree and a large bush, and then obviously the fence on the backside here. I'm not really worried about it falling over. That said, once it gets a little bit larger and starts fruiting and those fruiting canes become heavy, I will add a wire trellis just around the backside here, or even maybe push it back towards the fence and add a little bit of wiring trellis there on the fence so that I can support those fruiting canes and prevent them from kind of drooping over onto the ground. If I was planting directly into the ground, I would definitely prioritize a trellis system earlier. Raspberries are a little bit hungrier than, say, a blackberry or even a blueberry, so it's not a bad idea to add a balanced fertilizer at the time of transplant, say a 10-10-10. This particular mix is so heavy in manure already that all I've done was add a little bit of compost to the planting hole and then side dressed with some worm castings. I think that's going to be plenty, at least in the short term. I might add some fertilizer once it begins to fruit. Another note on location is that raspberries require about 800 chill hours, so hours where the temperature is below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. In my location, we do generally get that. However, there are years where we don't. So by placing it back here where we get very little sunlight period for 3 months out of the year, the ambient temperatures are quite cool, and I will be insured of at least 800 hours every year. Pro tip, if you did buy a thorned variety like this one, a location like this that is outside of sort of primary walking paths is a real good idea. Once this gets bigger, these thorns are going to be no joke, and potentially a little bit dangerous if you've got little ones running around. The thorns can be a little bit annoying, but I actually have started to prioritize plants with some natural defense mechanisms just because we have so many pests around here that would happily eat all of the fruit before me and my family get to enjoy and eat ourselves.